Welcome to the webinar. This is Reframing Indigenous Community Collections in Stewardship. I am Dixie Clough. I'm the Director of Museums Alaska. We're the statewide museum association here in Alaska. I think the name gives it away. So I know we have many people joining us from outside of Alaska, lower 48 people, Hawaii, and we're happy that you're here. Thank you so much for coming. I did want to let you know that you might have your own state museum association, and you should definitely look them up because state museum associations are amazing. They're wonderful resources and a great way to build a community inside your own state. I'm on the board of the Coalition of State Museum Associations. So just giving a little plug for all the other state museum associations out there. Also, I know there's a lot of people from Alaska here and also not from Alaska who might want to come. We have a conference this year in September 25th to 28th. So I just wanted to remind people about the conference. It'll be in Fairbanks. Registration will open in a month or so. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to hand things over to the architect behind this event, Selena Ortega-Chiolero. Selena was on our board for 6 years. I've been here about 3 years now, and she was my board president for 2 of those. She's absolutely amazing. She turned off last year, but we're so lucky that we can post this event with her. She put it all together, and it's going to be amazing. I can't wait to listen and learn from all the amazing speakers and from Selena. And I am going to go ahead and pass it on to you, Selena.
Thanks, Dixie. Guiraba Michael Warakuhu, Selena Ortega-Chiolero. Onenene Resna El Ista, Ana El Denainanen, Museum Specialist Naidiniana Kayak, Rahuesna. Greetings, everybody. My name is Selena Ortega-Chiolero. I am Raramuri, also known as the Tarahumara, from the Barranca de Cobra region of Chihuahua, Mexico. I live and work on Matanuska Riverland. For those of you not from Alaska, that's South Central Alaska, ancestral homelands of the Atna and Dena'ina Dene, where I am the museum specialist for Chickaloon Village Traditional Council, the governing body of Naidiniana Kayak, Chickaloon Native Village. In 2021, I had the privilege of becoming a fellow in the University of Virginia's Rare Book School's Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage. The fellowship was designed to support diverse racial or ethnic community cultural heritage professionals and advance multicultural collections through innovative and inclusive community practice and leadership. As part of the capstone of the fellowship, each fellow was awarded funding to host a community symposium to help advance the understanding of cultural heritage, archives, and/or special collections. Simultaneously, in 2023, I was accepted into the master's program in cultural administration with a tribal focus on tribal museums and cultural centers at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which I'm currently in my last semester. My thesis topic is on developing a new framework for the stewardship of cultural heritage materials of Indigenous communities, a topic that is very important to me. As an Indigenous cultural heritage professional who has been confronted with many barriers when working in spaces that house Indigenous materials that are operated by non-Indigenous institutions and professionals, I've come to recognize the perceptions, practices, and pathways that need to be changed to help us circumvent these barriers. I decided to leverage both my fellowship and graduate school opportunities to not only support my thesis research, but also for the betterment of my fellow cultural heritage colleagues who are working in the sector. This is where we find ourselves here today. As some of you already know, I love to network and help build connections and relationships. So when I first envisioned this event as a community conversation, I knew I wanted to bring together the smartest, most passionate, and dedicated people I know who are doing amazing work across archives, museums, and tribal cultural resources. It is my hope that for the next hour and a half, we can listen, share, and learn from them and each other so that we may better and serve our communities and strengthen our abilities to protect, preserve, and perpetuate the Indigenous cultural knowledge, language, and connections that are embedded in the cultural materials, or rather cultural expressions, that are in our care. I would like to note the conversations revolving around Indigenous materials can often bring an array of emotions to the surface in all of us. Those of us who identify as Indigenous may see things that may make you uncomfortable or that you may even disagree with. But these comments are not intended to harm, but rather to educate. As this is intended to be a safe and welcoming space, I'd like to ask all of our attendees today to please be respectful and considerate in your comments and questions. And we do welcome your questions when prompted. With that, I'd like to pass it on now to my friend and esteemed colleague, Vina Begay.
Hi, thank you, Selena. Hi, everyone. Yate, Vine Bigay Yidishya, Klash Cheatin and Schlen, Kiani Bashish Chin, the Bahadasha J, Ashin Hede Chanele, Twatat, New Mexico, Nasha. Hi, everyone. My name is Vina Bigay. I am from the Diné Nation from the Southwest states of New Mexico. Currently working as the assistant librarian and archivist for the Labriola Center here at Arizona State University. We are an Indigenous Library and Archive Center. ASU sits on the ancestral territories of the Aqua Autumn and the Peeposh community. I am honored to be your moderator for today and engage with our panelists to share some of their decolonial approaches towards collection stewardship. Today's event will be open discussion focusing on the work of our panelists for the first 30 minutes, then breaking out into participants into breakout rooms. This will give you as attendees to interact with our panelists one-on-one, and then we will gather into the main room to wrap up our final questions. So now I'm going to pass it on to our panelists to introduce themselves. If you could tell us your name, your tribal affiliation, the community you serve, and briefly describe your position. I will start with Angela Dima.
Dema. Yeah, thanks.
Dima, sorry.
No worries. I live and work on Dena'ina Homelands here in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm the senior curator at the Alaska Native Heritage Center, which is the only statewide cultural center that represents all Alaska Native peoples. I've worked with Alaska Native artists and culture bearers for over 20 years now, and I'm originally from St. Paul, Minnesota. So thanks for being here, and honored to be amongst such great speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, and I will pass it on to Helena.
Aloha mai kakoa na hoa maka maka. Greetings, everyone. My name is Selena Kapuni Reynolds. I was born and raised on the island of Hawaii. I am Kanaka Oiwi, or Native Hawaiian, through my maternal mo'oku auhau, or genealogies that connect me to the districts of Hilo, Puna, Ka'u, Kona, and Kohala on the island of Hawaii. Currently, I work remotely in Hilo for the National Museum of the American Indian as their associate curator for Native Hawaiian history and culture. So my position is a 3-year funded position through the Asia Pacific American Center. This is another unit of the Smithsonian. And as my job title suggests, I focus primarily on projects related to Native Hawaiians. And if we're to break that down a little bit further, my work can be kind of categorized into 4 areas, which is research and scholarship, exhibits and public programs, collections, and my favorite of the bunch, public service. So I'm really grateful to be able to join you all today. Aloha.
Thank you. And I will pass it on to Colleen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. No tepin manayan hopi matiwa no hopanga au sino no katinwa. My Hopi name is Tepin Mana. I am from the village of Hopewella. That's where I reside in the Hopi Reservation in Arizona, and I am Kachina clan. And I am currently the managing director for the Hopieville Learning Center. It's a newer initiative based on an old project of the Hopi tribe trying to create and build a Hopi cultural education center for the community. I'm responsible for all of the project management, networking with different funders, and mainly project development. But I also wear several hats with a lot of community curation and also museum consultation work, because we currently don't have a facility here. So we manage that through different spaces within the tribe. And so I just do a variety of things here on Hopi. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will pass it on to Monique.
Wambana hain hema, denewe veo kachi mbesua kotam, wakna posa ko wakotam, no ma egno ke wakma egno nia, danamena ane payak. So hello, greetings everybody. It's good to see you all today. My name is Monique Tyndall. I am of Lynx clan on my mother's side. I'm a member of the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohicans. On my father's side, I am Omaha and the Skokie Creek of the Elk clan. And my mother's people are originally from our Mohican homelands located in what is now known as the Hudson River Valley, or our namesake, the Mahicanatuck. Our territory is in New York, Western Massachusetts, and down into northeastern New Jersey. So we are Mohican and Munsee speaking Lenape peoples. And I serve as a director of cultural affairs for the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohicans. And my job entails the oversight of our tribal library museum, language program, and historic preservation office that is located in our homelands in Massachusetts. Anishik Onewe, thank you.
Thank you. And then Angie.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Angela Wade. I'm from Chickaloon Village. I'm Atna Dene. I'm specifically from Sidaketna, or Grandmother's Place Creek, also known as Moose Creek. Our traditional territory is a lot of South Central Alaska and a lot of interior Alaska. And then through trade all the way up to the Arctic Ocean and all the way down to Newchek, which is in Prince William Sound. I work as a tribal historic preservation officer, and through that work, I get to negotiate and work with the federal, state, academic, and local organizations to protect history, whether it be photo collections or the accurate interpretation of our history as we see and understand it, or sacred landscapes. And that's all for now. Chinan.
Thank you, everyone, for taking the time, and we will get into our discussion. I know many of you, I've worked with several of you, and this is my first time meeting a few of you, but I know from the background of everybody, for many of us here, we are experiencing and advocating the need for museums, libraries, and archive practices to be more community participatory and focus on tribal community methodologies. In fact, there are tribal nations incorporating all three fields together. For most of our panelists here, they are making that progress in their community to incorporate all three of the fields, including transitioning away from the institutional titles of museum, library, and archives. So my first question is to all the panelists. Each of you are working for your community or consulting with tribal communities, and this includes doing community engagement within the community. So my first question is, tell us, what does community-centric collection mean to you and your community? So we will start with Angie.
Okay, good morning. Because we've experienced contact since about the 1740s, and it's been a really condensed contact with a lot of assimilation through forced institutionalization and stuff, a lot of things have been kind of removed from our history. And then our elders that have come through didn't talk about it because it was too painful. And so I feel like the work that we do is inherently restorative because we're able to tell our stories and fill in those gaps with oral history interviews that are brought up by the items and photos and things that we can discuss with community, as well as going to the landscape and talking about that, because the landscape is where these things ultimately come from and where these activities happen. So being able to kind of see it all in a holistic, full picture of our history and how it integrates with all of the things that we're looking at. Chinan.
Thank you, and I will pass it to Monique.
So the development of the tribe's archival collection here at the Library Museum really centered on this question as far as like who we are as Mohican peoples and Munsee peoples. And Where is that history? And that question centers from the fact that we were dispossessed from our homelands. We experienced contact in 1609 by Henry Hudson, who came up with the Mahikanataka Half Moon. And in the early 1800s, we were dispossessed. A lot of that dispossession and being almost like in a refugee status really took place after we assisted General George Washington and the colonists in winning the American Revolution. We were involved in many of the battles. One of the most well-known battles is the battles of the Bronx, or the battles of Kingsbridge, which after the war had ended, George Washington had thanked us by holding an ox roast in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which was the last stronghold of our traditional territory, and then proceeded to direct us to remove from our remaining ancestral land. And so we ended up here eventually on the traditional lands of the Ometnamewak, or the Menominee peoples in north central Wisconsin. So from the mid 1800s to the mid 20th century was like this whole period of disconnection from land, disconnection from ancestral sites, from sacred sites, from our namesake, the Hudson River. And so we started developing an understanding of how to access archival materials, how to do research, and how to bring those items, or at least surrogates, back home. Back then it was like copies or even handwritten notebooks that were brought back from research trips, either in our homelands or large Eastern federal repositories. And then also starting to collect within our community to retain what oral histories had remained from like current elder generations and beyond. So to me, a community-centric collection is a collection that's directed by the community. It seeks to meet a specific need or to try to answer or a specific question. And the collection is driven by the community, and it is contributed wholly by the community. And even how it's described and organized is by the way that the community needs to best access that information.
Thank you, Monique, and I will pass it on to Colleen.
Okay, so I was breaking it down for us because, like, you're asking what is community-centric collection, and I think there's two versions within our tribe. There's the community that themselves are collecting things, items for it to be an actual use. We have a different version of that within our own community because we have 12 different villages, several different clanships. And so we all collect items for our own use and for the purpose it was intended for and created. And we collect a little bit different in our communities. We collect to give, to enrich, strengthen our roles within our community. And this is how we provide care for these items, is to actually put it into use. And so there is just no one general way of collecting things within the community. And then the other part, I think that's what more people are interested in, is the museum-based collection. I think these two concepts are kept very separate within our communities because we collect stuff for our own community use, for it to be used. And then we have the institutional-based collections that we oftentimes consult with different organizations of various items, more for the intent of the actual item itself rather than for their own use. So we lead with a lot of compassion and empathy, as we're looking at these items and how that plays a role in our community and what's going to be decided about a particular item. Most importantly, if it's safe to bring back to our communities, because a lot of these items were from burials. They were items that were taken without permission that might kind of have a bad energy to it, or it's maybe something that we might not be able to bring back into our communities, and how can we best utilize those resources? And so the positive results of those collaborations have been obviously shared collaboration, correction of information that leads to misappropriation, and then positive use of technology. We can kind of show our communities on the possibilities of collaborating with different museums and their collections. As I stated previously, we don't have our actual facility, a collections repository. We don't have a full-fledged archive. So we do a lot of consultation with different organizations through MOUs, through defining different terms about how we would like to utilize our own cultural materials within their facilities. And then we also have learned over the years that we can't really expect these institutions to be able to care for our items the way we do. And that is totally separate, because this concept of collecting was more based on ownership rather than stewardship. And so that's where our values are very different. And so we understand that, and just want to be able to maintain our cultural assets on our own within our communities and their different relationships and responsibilities to these objects. So that's kind of what it means for our tribe, the Hopi tribe. Everybody is very unique in their own way, and I'm just thankful that we have a very diverse set of villages that are their own, and so that's kind of what it means for us.
Thank you, Colleen, and I will pass it to Helena.
Okay. So when I think of community-centric collections within the context of Hawaii and within Native Hawaiian communities, I immediately think of grassroots organizations that are doing the work of collecting objects, stories, and archival materials that might otherwise not be collected or preserved in larger institutions. These smaller organizations serve vital roles in ensuring that community histories and memories are not forgotten, but are actively stewarded and made accessible to community members and to researchers, especially those who do research on behalf of their own communities. So organizations in Hawaii that actively collect and care for community-centric collections, and I'll note that some of these organizations are not necessarily just Native Hawaiian focused, but there's opportunities and hopefully efforts to really address that within our organizations to ensure that there is a space around collecting Native Hawaiian community histories. They include the Lyman House Memorial Museum in Hilo, which is one of the first museums that I ended up working at as a young person, the Honoka'a Heritage Center in Hamakua, the Kona Historical Society in South Kona, the Lanai Heritage Center on the island of Lanai, the Hula Preservation Society in Kaneohe Oahu, and the Ipumakani Heritage Center on Molokai, which recently launched a collaborative digital repository with various community-centric collections from their island. So I'm going to post the link here for folks who want an example. I am a big fan of Ipumakani because I've been following them over the past, I think it's been about a decade now of their growth and really building capacity to be able to launch this repository. So these are just some of the organizations that I think about within Hawaii. Secondly, community-centric collections make me think about the kupuna or elders in our communities who collect and care for their family heirlooms and collections, as well as community memorabilia that they've collected over the years. And this is something I've been particularly interested in my own personal work. Within my own community, I come from the Kilkaha Hawaiian Homeland community, where we were established under the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act in 1924. So this year we're celebrating our centennial. So an apt opportunity for collecting and thinking about, what are those important objects and stories that we need to collect for the next generation after being around for 100 years. And so in my own family, I think about my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandmother, all of whom were big community folks who acquired objects and documents throughout their lifetimes as they lived in Kilkaha, that as somebody who thinks about history and who understands the importance of objects in telling community history, understands that these, pieces that I've inherited help us to better understand what our community's past was like. So, just some of the examples of materials that I could think of that I've acquired include some of the first books that formed the first collection of our local elementary school library. My grandmother kept a meticulous collection of funeral service pamphlets and obituaries, right? Being able to see even material culture change in those things over time, changes in how people are honoring those of our loved ones who have passed on. And then I also have some things from my great-grandmother. The thing that I always thought was exciting was I have a notebook that contains meeting minutes from the Kilkaha Panaevo Farmers Association from the 1950s that she used at some point to post recipes on afterwards. So, one day it's my hope to, find this repository and steward a place where we can care for these collections for our community. And my hope is that we'll be able to establish a center where these materials can be stewarded, interpreted, and made accessible to the community as we struggle with our day-to-day realities and remembering and honoring those who came before us. So though some family collections do end up in a repository at some point in their lifetime, as we know through our practice, there are many others that do not. And I think about this especially within our communities, because as we know, elder passes on, their collections or the things that they've amassed over their lifetime might be dispersed amongst family members after their death. And, oftentimes as well, there are things that get discarded because family members don't understand the value of those collections to their family or their larger community, or they just don't know that there are places where they can take these collections to, develop to determine what would be important to preserve for the community. And, this is a particular issue when it comes for Indigenous communities that don't have cultural centers and who, again, largely remain suspicious of museums and archives for various reasons. In my community, it's always been, the local museum is not for us, it's for visitors and tourists who come to Hawaii. So really trying to break down those barriers is a lot of work in itself, but is really important and key to developing these relationships across institutions and Native communities. So thus, we can also think of community-centric collections as those collections formed out of love and care for our communities by those who recognize their value in helping future generations to connect with their ancestors, learn their heritage, and hopefully understand the importance of investing in organizations stewarding our collections. And I'll end there.
All right, thank you. And I will pass it on to Angela.
Thank you. So community-centric collecting or collections, I believe means that the communities that are represented in the collection have authority to direct the interpretation, the collection and collecting, the care and access to those collections. Here at the Alaska Native Heritage Center, there are 5 cultural advisory committees for the vast number of 20 languages that are spoke here in Alaska, and Indigenous that represent Indigenous people from all over Alaska. And those 5 groups really dictate to us interpretation and lead us to tell the truth about Alaska Native histories, art, cultures, and it's a way, I think, to really promote the healing of Alaska Native people through sharing their own stories here at the center. So community-centric collection really refers to complete authority to tell their story from their perspective, in my opinion.
Thank you, Angela. So we'll go to our next question. As many of our panelists have discussed, we're talking about stories. And as tribal community members, we know that land has such a huge wealth of information towards our ceremonies, our stories, our origin stories, everything in our lifeways. So in terms of, museum, library, and archives, we look at information in more objective forms. We look them as museum objects or textbooks or photographs. As Native people, we don't really look at that type of materialistic viewpoint in terms of information. We more look at more of a holistic environmental, right? So this question is for Angie and Monique. Within your position, your focus is involving with land. Tell us how you incorporate land-based information into your collection and community engagement. We will start with Angie.
Chinan. Hey, I was remiss in not recognizing Selena and how appreciative I am to work with her and you guys. What a wealth of knowledge. And I'm humbled to be here. So thanks for that. And I'm sorry, my apologies for my manners for not saying so earlier. But in my work with land, I think, we're able to do some really cool projects where we're nominating a land form who has personhood through the traditional cultural place project, through NPS. But through that, we're actually going out and doing the archaeological work on site. And we're working with other tribes to interpret the knowledge, because in Alaska, the Atna people, there's several different tribes. And so to interpret knowledge and get those traditional stories that have to do with this landform that has morality stories attached to her. So we get to do this all-inclusive thing, and with oral history and place and archaeology and connectivity with trails, that is really exciting. And additionally to that, there's another project that I'm working on that I'm very excited about, because we have a rock ring called Stonehenge, and it's big. It's really big. And we went up and we worked with our archaeologists. We went up there and we were looking at it, and we've taken some dates that are 3,400 and some years old. We know that. But when we were up there, I got to looking towards a traditional hunting area and thinking, man, those rocks look screwy. So we found another rock ring. And so now we have the digital imagery, the LiDAR, and there's a photogrammetry word for it that's real nerdy that I don't remember right now. But we're going to be able to take that and spin it around landscape form, digital model style, so that the elders that are not going to be able to make it up to those high places can see it in a very tangible, touchable way. And then we can start to ask what these structures may be, because we don't know. And we're not sure if these are in our oral histories or not. So we're going to get to do that work, being able to show these digital images while we do interviews to try to figure out what these things are. So that it excites me about these projects, but it helps inform how we use landscape in order to move forward to protect it. So if that makes sense. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And Monique.
So there's multiple ways that we're looking at using land in our work. One of the first projects that we undertook that directly had a connection to land was a Common Unities project that was a partnership with the Native Northeast Collaborative. They are the East Mukutu Hub. And with that, we went through a lot of the land deeds from this area that's located in the southwest corner of Connecticut, where there was the Tungus band of Munsee-speaking Lenape peoples. And like the Tungus, there's a lot of different families that came over from that village. And some of those surnames still live today. One of the surnames has now been shortened to Tulsi. So if you are familiar with Native film, you'll know of the actress Sheila Tulsi, who's Menominee and Stockbridge Munsee. So like her family comes from that area. And we found that in those land deeds, a model for how land was used, how it was managed, and how it was used to form relationships there and shared like within amongst the families or relatives or passed on to other community members. One thing that we really did discover that was quite interesting with this area that is now known as Farmington, Connecticut, that there was a old battle between Tungus and Mohegan people, where the Mohegans came up and attacked that village. And it's like this battle that's along the river there. And when it seemed like the Tungus people were about to be defeated, the women took up arms and came in and wiped out a lot of like the Mohican warriors in that battle. And so it's really interesting to find those stories about women and their role in our tribe, or our tribes, I'd say, our ancestral lineages. And with us being like belonging to matrilineal societies, how those roles of women aren't as fixed as what we're led to believe through ethnological reports and documentations about my tribe. But then we find that with those deeds, they also tell the story of genocide and displacement, and how a lot of these tribal villages were trying to find a way to form relationships or like make amends, to form bonds in order to survive. So those village members actually relocated down to that Mohegan stronghold, Wonotocook, which is known today as Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And so we see that too, where we had like those families who were living in Wonotocook and then still managing their land up in Farmington and trying to take care of like the land holdings they had up there, and then what to do with them. Also, we learned that the community would take a trip annually back up to Farmington around a specific time of year, and to take care of the burials. And that really ties into like a seasonal practice that we have, where we take care and we honor and those ancestors. And usually it requires like visiting up at the burial site as well. So it's really a really beautiful thing to see this tie to land and movement and people during a really destructive time in our history. You know, thinking what that must have been like for them, like seeing the end of a way of life and end of the world. It's almost you could describe it as almost being like an apocalypse. And now with the work that we're doing now, it's like restoring from that and trying to figure out how do we restring that bundle now that we're living in a post-apocalyptic world, you know, that we're doing all this restorative work. But then within that, there's also that hope of and idealism and dreaming that happens of what work could we be doing if we didn't have to do all this restorative work? What kind of contributions can we be making to the greater whole of humanity if we weren't consistently trying to pick up the pieces and put everything back together? So I know like with the work that I do, I look forward to that day when future generations will no longer have to do that restorative work, but actually to contribute to things now and to the future. And then another part that's really interesting with land is going back to the homelands, going back and seeing the different sites, and then also walking different trails and everything with a fellow community member who knows a lot about our traditional plant knowledge. And even with what limited knowledge I have from my family, seeing a lot of the plants in our homelands are identical to the ones that are here, like on our reservation located on the original lands of the Menominee. So it really makes sense to me why our ancestors refused to move any further west in Wisconsin, because the land drastically starts to change more into prairie. So like where we are located, like a lot of the plants, the animals, the ecosystem is very much similar to our homelands out east.
Thank you, Monique. I do like the concept of the apocalypse, post-apocalypse, because, sometimes it does feel that way. But we're also trying to, yeah, as you mentioned, the work that we all do it's a lot of work, right? To do all of that reparative stuff and picking up the pieces. Now, speaking of that, a lot of these information are all across Western institutions. And this next question goes to Colleen and Helena, because your background has done a lot of consultation works to bring a lot of those information back to the community, and making sure, a lot of these informations are used to revitalize a lot of our culture, to reconnect, as what Angela and Monique talk about with the land, right? How are you, in your role, how are you ensuring these materials are shared within your community? We'll start with Helena.
Thanks, Vina. So before I answer this question, I want to backtrack a little bit to talk about the communities that I serve. So as Associate Curator of Native Hawaiian History and Culture at NMAI, I am tasked with essentially serving the Native Hawaiian community, which is quite large and expansive. And some of you actually might be wondering, why are Native Hawaiians included in the National Museum of the American Indian? Well, the quick answer to that is that when NMAI was founded by an act of Congress in 1989, there was a major Hawaii festival that was organized by the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. This is another Smithsonian unit, and this was held in Washington, D.C. So that festival elevated the profile of Native Hawaiian history and culture on the National Mall. And at the same time, one of the senators who was really prominent in the passing of the NMAI Act was the late Senator Daniel Inouye from Hawaii. So because of these two very specific things happening during this time, you see this special inclusion of Native Hawaiians within the museum's overall scope, which is to represent and to have a space on the National Mall for the Indigenous peoples of the Americas and more broadly, the Western Hemisphere. And so when I think about kind of the communities that I serve, it is not just Native Hawaiian communities that reside in Hawaii, but also those who live in diaspora, wherever that may be. And of course, that's a big task for one person to try to do, but I rely a lot on people reaching out to me who are looking for assistance, who are looking for examples of collections that they might want to start at home, opportunities to bring objects back to our communities. So it's really those individual to individual relationships that I rely on to help build my own network, but also to support my community in the way that I can. And then, of course, as I've mentioned, on a more personal note, I really do a lot of work within my own community in Kilkaha to try to develop, I guess, a museum consciousness around the importance of having some kind of repository, especially, I'm sure many other Indigenous communities can relate. Elders love talking story. They love being able to share their stories with their young ones, but we're not always thinking about the material things that can help us to convey those stories and to teach our young people about who our elders were. So I'm hoping to really be able to support those efforts locally in Hilo, which is where I work remotely for NMAI. So back down to the question itself, what I want to kind of touch on a little bit is that within NMAI itself, we don't have quite a large Hawaiian collection. There's about, give or take, 22 Hawaiian objects, and most of them are contemporary works. And over the years, most of the collections that Native Hawaiians visiting museums are looking for are historical collections, are those materials that for a long time they were denied access, that depending on who was in that position, right, because it always falls down to the individual curators who are in these roles, either allowing them that opportunity to visit collections and to engage in with objects in ways that are more than just open the drawer and look in and don't touch, but really trying to find those ancestral pieces that allow them to imagine what life was like before contact, soon after contact, ancestral forms that folks are in the process of revitalizing today. And when we think about historical Hawaiian collections at the Smithsonian, the bulk of those collections, as with many other historical Indigenous collections, is the Natural History Museum, the Smithsonian Institution National Museum of Natural History. And most of their Hawaiian collection is from the 19th century, mid to early 19th century, some significant pieces associated with our chiefs as well. And so even though I don't work for the Natural History Museum, I have a good working relationship with the current curator of the Oceanic Collection, Josh Bell. His title is Curator of Globalization. And so the report that we have now is that, as he gets requests all the time from different communities across the Pacific to access collections, and he's been really trying his best to make sure that when those requests come in, they can accommodate it and they can take them into the storage rooms. I am that person that oftentimes community members will reach out to me knowing that I work for the Smithsonian. They may be visiting DC for a few days for work, for meetings, or to see family. And so they'll ask me, where can I go to see collections? And so I'll point them towards the Natural History Museum. And I'll encourage folks as well, if they're planning to come to DC, hey, you should definitely go and check out go and check out these collections if you're interested. And on that note as well, some of you may know the Smithsonian recently adopted a policy around ethical returns and shared stewardship. So I'll pull that up later and share it in the chat. And that is something else that I'm also trying to raise awareness around within the Native Hawaiian community, that we do have these policies now that create a process by which community members can request for things to be returned home, especially if there are objects of, that may not necessarily fall under NAGPRA, but are still really significant to bring home to the community. And so, given those experiences, I really see myself as a facilitator for our community, as a bridge builder, hoping to make those connections to other institutions and help our community understand how museums work and why they do things in certain ways that we might not necessarily agree with or understand for ourselves, but then also translating community concerns back to institutions that they're saying these things because of these reasons. And as institutions, we really need to learn how to better listen to community and adapt policies in ways that cultivate that need for access, but also a feeling that these institutions are listening and actually caring for the people whose collections that they retain. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Colleen?
Great, thank you for that. It's very great to see all of you guys' organizations and what you guys do. I come from a real from a ground level perspective of doing things here in Hopi. Lately, how we've been trying to ensure our community is involved with these materials in different institutions is that we have to give them sort of a guide into how to access them. They're very intimidated by making a request through email. A lot of our elders don't have email. The most traditional people aren't on social medias or know how to go about for a visit request and any of these. So we try to maneuver them through that process in a very user-friendly way, and sometimes mostly on their behalf. And a lot of times people think that it's such a foreign concept that they're not allowed in these spaces. And so a lot of times we facilitate for different organizations, different groups of people within our community based upon what we know is available there. Or if an organization comes to us and says, we have this type of material, we would like to see what the community's response is, how we are caring for it, how the community would like to utilize that. And so a lot of times we're careful in these ways of taking different groups to the museums or learning about that. And a lot of it has to do also with the maturity level within our communities. We still are very careful in not taking community members who may not be initiated in these types of different societies, these type of deities. So we're very careful with that also in the consultation process. But I think it's very important to show them how to move through these spaces so that way they can do it on their own, for their own communities, for their own families, and more importantly, for their village. Like I keep stressing that we have 12 different villages, we have 12 different ways of doing things. And I'm sure that's the way it is for every Native community in how we're unique in our own way. And then I think it's important for them to also understand their limitations there, because when they get there, we're so used to embracing these objects how we want to. But there's a lot of limitations on what they can or cannot do. And I think it's important to explain that to them and why, like taking photos or handling them without gloves. And what the process is if in fact they would like to see the item repatriated, or in a sense some type of a loan agreement. And then it's important to explain to our community members on how the object got there. You know, what purpose does it serve within that organization or that facilities? And then after that, we kind of go into more about, okay, we're here now. What is your idea of what we can do with these items within our own community? And oftentimes they're reminders to restart or reinvigorate these techniques, these conversations of what we're not doing anymore. So a lot of that is, a lot of times they're conversation pieces that people can go home and to their own families and talk about, well, I remember when I used to do this with my uncles, my mothers, of a different technique, of a different style. And that is all immersed in language. And so oftentimes just being able to, it's as if we're visiting with an ancestor, an old ancestor we haven't seen in a long time. We're having those conversations. And emotion is always involved when we're visiting collections. It may be a good emotion, it may be a sad emotion. So we kind of have to acknowledge that in these spaces and kind of be more kind to each other as far as like being around these objects. It's not, we're totally connected to them rather than disconnected. And so acknowledging those feelings and how it made them feel is something also that we have to be very delicate about when visiting these spaces. But more so, we also try to go down the avenue of technology with either encouraging these institutions when they want to collaborate, of bringing some type of digital piece back to the community. We live so far away from these institutions. A lot of times they want information for us, but what are they reciprocating back to our communities is a big thing that we like to push for. You know, our elders have dialysis like 3 times a week. They can't travel to Flag, they can't travel to Phoenix, New York, anywhere. And not only that, they don't have the capacity for traveling there. And so these are the real issues that we're dealing with when we want our communities to access these type of collections. And so I think that's the big push in how are you bringing that to our communities, and would it serve us, and how can we do that collectively? All other projects that we've done in the past, I know through my work, is of course traveling exhibitions, having them travel back home into schools, into elderly centers. And I've also played around a little bit with home exhibits in providing this content in the home of elders, just because they're shy, just because they don't like that pressure of having to get ready and go somewhere. They're just really comfortable in their own home. So we've had home exhibits where we're providing this experience within their home. And then more so lately with Zoom, if there's particular collections items that a facility would like consultation on, it's not the best, and I don't recommend it to suffice the real experience of an actual artist visit to a collection where they can actually touch the object, kind of like for potters, for example. We were doing a consultation with Tucson Museum of Art, and the potters just kept saying, I wish I could touch that pot. I wish we could talk into it to see the depth of it, or how it was made, or if the slip is actually on there. So these are the different details that matter to us that may not be that the major institution is not thinking of, but that's how we learn, that's how we interact with them. So it's sometimes a barrier for us to even provide that consultation without actually physically being there. But we have maneuvered through different spaces. And like I said, we've been able to take different artists to different museums, different collection spaces, and they're just always so revived afterwards. They're like, man, we need to go home and we need to do this, and we're forgetting about these gathering parties we used to do. We're forgetting to teach the different styles in our own language rather than in English. And so the depreciation of our language is really evident. And so we try to have those very important reminders when we go back to our own communities. And so these are the ways that I've been able to help my community be active in the work of collections in different spaces. So thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. I really like your response to the harmfulness. And this is something that I've experienced working in the archival side, especially when it comes to consultation from non-tribal or Western institutions, is they're not mindful of the spiritual, the cultural protocols. There's certain things that have to be for tribal members, they have to do a ceremony or things like that. There's certain taboos that they're not supposed to see. Right. So it's just a little awareness for non-tribal people in our audience is to be mindful of those spiritual harms. You have to do the inventory first before consulting with tribal communities for these very reasons. It's also important to understand, to do some more background of the tribal locations that you are serving in your area. And this goes on to another topic that you have brought up too, that is provenance is such a huge issue with tribal communities. Provenance has such a tie with ownership, with our objects, or intellectual property with our information, right? So one of the things that you also brought up, collection scope too, it does make it difficult for tribal members to go across the United States. It's one of the push that we also recommend a lot of our non-tribal institutions to understand, to redefine your collection scope, to focus on those materials around your regional area because of these very reasons. So I'm passing this information to Angela. As a non-Indigenous professional and working with Alaskan Native communities, how much has changed in the field you started, and how has your understanding shifted in managing cultural collections about communities? And just to be on time, this will be our last question so we can move to our breakout. So I will pass this question to Angela.
Thank you. So obviously change has been really slow. That's universal, right? When you're making meaningful change. My work in museums started in 1990 as NAGPRA was enacted. And there are still many museums who continue to share and interpret Indigenous collections without sharing authority by involving multiple cultural advisors. So I would say the field hasn't shifted as much as I would have hoped by now. But when I began back in 2003 here at the Alaska Native Heritage Center, I was coming at my work the same way as I came at every other job that I had had in the past. I interpreted objects through an anthropological lens and cared for the physical needs of objects. Those were my main goals coming on to my job. My understanding obviously shifted over and it took a couple years actually for the community here to trust me, understandably, because a lot of museum relationships are fraught through colonialism and structural racism. And so as my understanding shifted, as I listened more and talked less, I learned more from Indigenous people. I understood that my voice and perspective shouldn't be centered here at the Alaska Native Heritage Center, and that in fact, I shouldn't be drafting interpretive text. The ideas about the collections and what should be shared should come from the community itself. So as much as possible these days, I recognize my cultural lens, and I try to avoid drafting text. And so part of the job that then I had to do was advocate for more staff. We're a very small staff here at the Heritage Center. And so making sure that Indigenous people were hired to draft text and be curators here at the center. And as you all are, I'm sure, very aware, there's not a lot of Indigenous curators around this country. There's a lack of people in the field. And so my goal here at the center is to bring up that next generation of Alaska Native youth. We have 4 apprentices working with our collections department right now. So really making sure that the voice that's being shared here is a genuine one from the community is really important. As much, and also important is the care management for cultural belongings made for and by Alaska Native people. I have an obligation, and I believe all non-Indigenous people have an obligation to understand the spiritual aspects of care that should go into taking care of collections and balancing not only the physical care, but the spiritual care of collections, and making sure that I understand access is primary to my job, that it's access to the level that when there is a class going on, a workshop, I am here after hours to make sure that people have access to the collections for endangered art forms that they're learning, and that I bring out collections, whether it's outside in the carving shed and it's raining out. It's a thing that we have to center and make sure that people have access to their collections. And this is not my collection. This is a collection of Indigenous objects made by Indigenous people. I also understand after 20 years of working in the Alaska Native artist community and with cultural bearers as well, that wholly Indigenous spaces are incredibly healing for Indigenous people. And so they don't always involve me and shouldn't. I shouldn't be always in the room hovering, watching objects, and that ownership of belongings is important, and that I leave the room when people need to commune and when artists visit their collections, when it's a way of showing trust between ourselves. And it's also really important. I see so many times people will have this great idea, and a non-Indigenous person might go out to this community and share collections, but they sit in the room the whole time, and the conversation will change as a result of your presence there. It's important to understand the fraught history of museums and to operate accordingly. I think those were my main points. I want to cut it so we have plenty of time for our other conversations.
Thank you, Angela. I really appreciate all those words, and it means a lot to, I'm sure, to all of us to hear that, you know, where you sit in terms of cultural collections. So now we're going to move into breakout rooms, and which our participants will be, whoever's here will be split in with our panelists.
Hi everyone, I'm going to do a quick intro on breakout rooms, but can we pause the recording first?
Is all my presenter panelists here?
It looks like 1, 2, 3. I think they are. Yep, there's.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, for the sake of time, we only have a few more minutes, and to wrap up all of this, we will have a list of contact information of all of our panelists at the very end, which I believe Selena will share. So just a couple of questions for our panelists, and this is by the raise of hands. How can non-Indigenous professionals best support self-determination, sovereignty, and revitalization in the care and management of Indigenous materials within their repository? Who wants to take that question?
I can start.
Okay.
So for this question, you know, I guess, let me try to make this a simple answer. So first, it's of course, you know, finding opportunities to learn more about Indigenous histories and community struggles. Oftentimes I tell people that pay attention to those invitations that are for all community. When Native community is saying, please come, see if you can, you know, accept those invitations and to learn from community. Don't just show up. There's a fine line between being invited and not being invited to these certain events. The other thing to do is that, especially with regards to, you know, efforts to bring Indigenous museum professionals on board within an institution, what we oftentimes see is that, you know, they get an Indigenous hire, and then those individuals are tasked with fixing the long-term colonial legacies of the institution without proper infrastructure or financial support. So, you know, as somebody who may be in a position of power, definitely take the time to work with your Indigenous employees to determine a workload that is sustainable and that builds in that interest for them to want to stay at your institution, as opposed to becoming burnt out and then leaving and not doing the work that they were tasked with doing. So definitely be cognizant about those things. I think as non-Indigenous professionals, we have to also recognize that in caring for our Indigenous museum colleagues, as well as the community we bring in, that is part of supporting self-determination and sovereignty, the right of people to be in our spaces, the right of people to engage with their collections in the ways that are meaningful to them. Those are just some of my thoughts on that particular question. I see Angie would like to respond.
I would love to add a little bit. So I think, you know, Alaska Native perspectives in our case here at the center, and presence, when you find yourself in a room with all non-Indigenous people talking about Indigenous cultural belongings and programs and exhibits, you need to advocate that there be people in there and not just one person from one culture representing 20 different groups, making sure that you involve the people you're talking about. I would say that's one thing. Pay people for their labor if they are on committees, regardless of whether other committees get paid. This is a fraught relationship that needs to be repaired. And so make sure people get paid. And then, of course, just be reliable, trustworthy, show up to community events when you're invited. It's important to show that you're there and be part of that community as much as you are invited to be. And then, of course, do your own research. Make sure you understand the people you are sharing, that you are using their collections and sharing their collections, that you do your own research, the fraught histories, you get as many Indigenous perspectives as you can. Those would be my few advice for people.
Hey, Monique, I see your hand raised, so I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. So one thing that I had learned is make sure if you're going for funding or creating projects that involve Indigenous communities, that you bring them to the table or at least invite them to co-develop that project. Because coming into this role, there was a lot of projects that I inherited where there was no real benefit directly to my community that was built in to grant-funded projects. Some of the projects that were awarded didn't come with a letter of support from our leadership. And sometimes grants were funded that the tribe didn't even know about, that they were written into. So make sure that you include the tribe right away instead of rushing to fill out a grant. And then a month before the grant deadline, you're calling up the tribe and asking them to be included, to include the tribe and on your grant project proposal. We all have different calendars that our tribal leadership adhere to meetings. A lot of times proposals need to go to tribal council to get approval because staff cannot bind a sovereign nation to any kind of legal contractual agreement, which after being awarded, that's what a grant does. There's that contract document. Then also I learned that MOUs are really helpful for tribal peoples when it came to setting clear boundaries and expectations. Because there's a lot of times where there's this natural tendency to extract time and resources away from Indigenous professionals or communities, whether that is asking us to do your research for you or like asking us for all these general questions when we have it on the tribal website or it's already published in books. So be mindful of that. The MOUs are really great in setting up those parameters as far as like what the tribe is willing to bring to the table and then what the institution or organization is going to give back. There has to be a relationship based on reciprocity established, and the MOU document is really good at ensuring that communication is there and that is legally binding. Anishik, thank you.
Thank you, Monique. And I just want to wrap up to resonate what Monique is saying too with MOUs and MOAs. Those relationship building should start from acquisition to every stages of the museum, library, and archives, from acquisitions, working with the tribal community, getting them involved, and also deaccessioning. All of those, every aspects of the stages should reflect in the MOUs and MOAs. So I do want to switch this back to Selena because we are finally, thank you everyone for your time. And I appreciate it, and I will pass it on to Selena.
Thanks, Fina. I know a lot of this webinar probably brought out more questions. So with that spirit, I really welcome folks to continue learning and engaging. And I know one of the things we often get asked are, where are some resources? So I have a bunch of wonderful resources. A lot of them were gathered from our panelists today, but other amazing professionals that I have the privilege and opportunity of knowing. So I've posted all of those resources onto my website, Cultural Heritage Steward. The link is at the front. Also, I think it's going on 2 years now. Museums Alaska and First Alaska's Institute did a series of wonderful webinars in regards to collections, Indigenous collections and museums. And in fact, I believe Melissa Shaganoff's on here, and she was one of the speakers for that series. So that's another really great resource for you to reach out to. So please feel free to continue these conversations moving forward. Dixie, can you go to the next slide, please?
It takes a while. Once it should be moving soon. Right, yeah.
Okay. Finally, I would really like to thank our amazing panelists who joined us today: Fina Begay, Angela Dema, Helena Kapuni Reynolds, Colleen Lucero, Monique Tyndall, and Angela Wade for agreeing to do this conversation. It's been wonderful learning from all of you and being able to engage with you. And thank you so much to all of our attendees as well. All the recordings for this will be available through Museums Alaska website and the Rare Book School's YouTube channel, which we will, since we have all of your emails, reach out to you and let you know when those will be posted. And once again, I really am so grateful for everybody that's here and really invite you to continue moving forward with these conversations because they are by far not done. Chinan, thank you all for attending.